Okay, in this lecture we're going to look at formalized rights. And these are the rights that are typically spelled out in a constitution. Sometimes they're interwoven inside the various articles of the Constitution. Sometimes they're set aside as a separate Bill of Rights. In the U.S. Constitution, they're set aside as a separate Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, though there are also formalized rights that are embedded in the text of the Constitution itself, though not very many of them, not very specific ones. Only certain very specific ones like no ex post facto laws and no writs of habeas corpus. In the U.S. Constitution, most of the formalized rights are listed in the first 10 amendments and then in sporadic other amendments throughout the rest of the 17. In a constitutional system, the rights don't have to be set aside, but the idea that they're formalized, that there are certain things that are guaranteed and that the democratic system is there to do one of two things: either provide those rights or protect those rights. And that might seem like a kind of a weird specious distinction, and I'll get to sort of what that means and how that makes sense in a minute. But I do just want to note, based here on the diagram, give you the big picture of the diagram. Democratic society is seen as having two different and separate spheres: the public sphere and the private sphere. The public sphere, sometimes called the public forum, is where the democratic system lives. It's where the people are making decisions collectively. It is a place that, because democracy is about finding and manifesting the will of the people, about manifesting popular sovereignty, basically, that there has to exist. There has to be a public forum. People have to come together to make decisions collectively. And of course, the democratic system is a highly competitive endeavor, deciding on, or where people compete to figure out what those decisions are going to be. And we've looked at a lot of the features of a democratic system. The formalized rights, the rights that are provided by the democratic system for people so that they can participate in the public sphere in a way that recognizes their essential membership as part of the people, as part of the collective. There's also a sense, because individual rights and liberty are essential principles of a democratic society. Democracy recognizes the fundamental individualism of the members of that society. One of the reasons why we want to find and manifest the will of the people is a recognition that people get to rule themselves. People rule themselves collectively, and they also rule themselves individually, and it's in the private sphere where individualism reigns, where people get to rule themselves privately. This is where the government has a role to not provide rights to make sure the collective decisions are made, but to protect rights between different members of that democratic society and different groups. So the government has two roles. One, to provide rights that facilitate this collective existence of the people, and two, to protect the individual rights of members of that society so they can live their lives the way they want to in that individual sphere. Now, each of these different spheres, which has a kind of a different nature, is occupied simultaneously by all members of society, right? You don't have to be out in the public forum, you don't have to be engaged in politics to be living in the public sphere. You're always, in a democratic society, living in the public sphere. And even when you're engaged in activities in the public sphere, when you're campaigning, when you're donating money, when you're lobbying, whatever it is you might be doing that's politically engaged, you also live in the private sphere. You are an individual person who is deciding how they want to live their life, what they want to do to pursue their own personal good. So there's the common good and there's the personal good. And that territory, it's not even really like this diagram is not a map of a territory where there's a place where there's the public forum and there's a place where there's private life. We can see the household as kind of the main figure of the private sphere, and the marketplace as the main, as another exemplar of the private sphere. But the private sphere exists everywhere. It's not a territory. The public sphere is also not just out in public, outside of buildings. The public sphere is also everywhere. Each of these different spheres has a set of rights that will be formalized And part of the question for a democratic society is, what will those rights be? Much like with the questions that we looked at in the first few modules of the course, where you have to decide, are we going to have proportional representation or district-based? Are we going to have rank preference voting or single candidate balloting? Are we going to, what kinds of offices are going to be? What are the qualifications? All of those many questions. There are lots and lots of options. There are also a lot of questions that about what specific rights in both of these spheres are going to be provided. And that's why different constitutional systems look different, and the people who live inside of those democratic societies have a different experience of both of these types of rights. I'll give you one or two examples, actually, that kind of distinguishes the United States from other major democracies. And that is, one, we have freedom of religion is a very important individual right. That right is not protected in every democratic society, and it's, in a way, it's kind of a choice. The other right that we have that is very much not widely given by other societies, freedom of religion is protected in a lot and not necessarily guaranteed in others, is the right to own firearms. Our Second Amendment is pretty unique in the global scheme of democratic societies. That is seen as an individual right. Sometimes it's seen as a political right that's necessary to keep government from being tyrannical. Not all rights will necessarily fall neatly into one of these two categories, and particularly you can see that economic rights are actually in both categories, because there are certain rights that are economic rights that are seen as kind of you have in relation to the government. The right to own property, for example, that the government can't just take that away, that's a right that you have in relation to the system of government. The right to free or to accurate consumer information is typically seen as one of the consumer rights over in the economic rights side of things that you have in relation to not necessarily the government, but to other economic actors, usually companies. And that is a right that's protected. Okay, so now, what about this distinction between provided and protected, right? Provided means that the government gives you these rights so that the political process can happen in a way that is free, fair, open, and has some kind of chance of representing the will of the people. Without some basic fundamental rights being provided, the claim can be, well, okay, people can vote and they can run for office and we have democratic systems, but we don't really have a kind of a collective decision-making process unless you have some of these basic rights that guarantee people the ability to participate in a meaningful way. And that's why they're provided. They're provided by the government so that you can have a relationship to the system of government that is gives you a meaningful ability to participate. And also that protects you against the government, right? They're provided by the government to protect you from the government. And that's an interesting, tricky thing, right? These protected rights, when the government's protecting, for example, your freedom of religion against other people, right? Telling you that you can or can't worship in a particular way, or when the government is providing you with individual rights like the freedom of action or exchange. You get to exchange your money for products as long as those products are harmful, and as long as the people you're exchanging the products and the money with consent to that. You're being protected from criminals. You're being protected from unscrupulous companies. You're being protected as an individual person by the government. This is one of the things that makes all governments, but democratic governments particularly tricky, is that the government is doing two jobs. It is protecting you from other people, but you also need protection from the government. The government is both your protector and a huge threat. And that actually makes the whole system of formalized rights a very tricky balancing act, because we want to empower the government to protect our rights, but we also want to make sure that we get enough ability to participate in the government so the government doesn't become tyrannical over us. Okay, now I just want to move through each of these categories and note, not in any comprehensive kind of way, but kind of in a schematic way, what the questions are, what the choices are that need to be made. But I will just, before I do that, I'll just again read these sentences down here. In the public sphere, the question is, what rights do people have in relation to the system of government, right? And then over here, what rights do people have in relation to other members of a free society that the government must protect? Now, the government also has to protect/provide these rights. So the government is doing work in both of these. Both of these are protected. So in a sense, that this distinction between provided and protected doesn't make sense. But hopefully you'll see when I begin to talk about them why there is a distinction. The public sphere consists of a political system, a legal system, which is necessary to make sure that people's individual rights are protected. Why do we need a legal system? Because there are people who break the law, and we need to process those violations of the law. If you don't have a legal system, people's individual rights aren't protected. There are also conflicts between people in the private sphere. These are called civil cases, and there needs to be a legal system that deals with both criminal cases and civil cases. The political system, political rights, obviously we have a political system, a democratic system, and you can't just say, okay, go ahead and vote and select and all that stuff. There are other things that need to be formalized to make sure that people can actually do that. Like, for example, the fundamental rights, political rights that can't be, that are not really up for debate are the right to vote, the right to run for office, the right to petition, and the right to, those are the ones. The other ones that the questions are is, okay, what kinds of political rights do you have in terms of not liking what's going on, right? Typically, the right to petition or protest is a political right, but how strong is that? Some constitutions actually contain a specific right to resist what people think of as unlawful or illegitimate actions of the government. That adds a layer of protection to the checks and balances system, and essentially says civil disobedience is a political right. Our system of government doesn't have that. The United States system of government doesn't have that. Many don't, but some of them do. Protecting the right to civil disobedience, is that necessary or not, right? Protecting the right to vote, absolutely. Though, of course, the question with political rights often is, what are the specific boundaries? What's the age? What are the limitations on the right to vote? Is it legitimate to say that people who violated the social contract by, for example, committing felonies, do they lose their right to vote or not, right? So we still have specific questions to answer about even the kind of fundamental rights, like the right to vote, the right to run for office, the right to petition the government, the right to protest. How strong is the right to protest? Does it go all the way to being able to resist? Does it include civil disobedience or doesn't it? Does it include protections for if that resistance actually becomes violent? Are you protected for not for the violent actions you take, but for the words and ideas that you express that are tied up with that? Or can you be punished for the ideas that are connected with your with the violent actions as well? These are big questions. Running for office, what are the term limits? Are there term limits, right? If there are term limits, that's a way of saying your right to run for office is limited. If there's a voting age, which every society has, that's a way of saying your right to vote is limited. If there are the possibility that felons don't have the right to vote, then people's right to vote is limited. All of these rights, all of them, are going to have to be limited in order to be meaningful. You can't just say, well, you have the right to vote. Well, okay, but does that everybody? Does a 1-year-old? You can't just say you have the right to run for office. Like, okay, do you have a right to run for the same office to term after term? Do you have to wait to be a certain age? Are there other qualifications? Do you, for example, have to have a law degree to be able to run for a judicial office if the selection mechanism is one of voting? Even if it's one of appointment, do you have to have a law degree to get a judicial appointment? Do you have to have some other kind of training? All of these are specific questions that need to get asked about every one of these kinds of rights. And again, I'm going to just kind of schematically go through this instead of trying to give you a comprehensive listing of them. Legal rights are really about equal protection. That's a fundamental legal right. Political equality and legal equality are kind of non-negotiable elements. But again, what does equal protection mean? Can certain groups of people be treated differently than other groups, but be said to be treated equally? And how do you decide which forms of differential treatment are acceptable and which forms of differential treatment are unacceptable? Now, in the United States, at the federal level at least, this question is left up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, through a variety of different precedents, has established certain kinds of doctrines of equal protection that allow groups to be treated unequally and other groups to be not treated unequally, that unequal treatment of two different groups is illegitimate except under a very narrow set of circumstances. One of the reasons why equal protection is a tricky principle is that the law itself treats people unequally by its very fundamental nature. You can't have a legal system and treat everybody the same, right? If one person breaks the law by stealing someone's car and another person doesn't break the law, we can't treat those people the same way. Now, that's an easy distinction, but then can we treat people differently based on age? Can we treat people differently based on race, religion, gender, profession, education level, income level? Those questions don't always get necessarily answered at a very fine-grained level in the Constitution itself, but they could, and they are important questions about our legal rights. And then there are really, the equal protection of the law is kind of a general legal right, and then there's the two sides of the legal system, the criminal system and the civil system. Now, as you might remember from the lecture on the judicial branch, judicial institutions, there are a lot of judicial institutions that may not neatly fit into one or the other of those categories, and there will need to be legal rights that, for example, deal with family court, right? Like, what kind of rights do juveniles have in relation to divorce proceedings? That's not specifically civil proceeding, but it falls into that category. Are there specific rights that are going to be had in family court, in drug courts, in tax courts? But in general, the legal rights are, one, a set of criminal defendants' rights, and two, a set of rights that pertain to civil cases, disputes between private parties, private individuals, or groups of people. Criminal defendants' rights are typically seen as fundamentally important because we have in the criminal justice system a fundamentally unequal battle, right? There's an unequal battle between the government, which is the prosecutor, and the defendant, which is usually just the lone individual. It could be a company, it could be a group, but in most cases it's the lone individual. And in order to make sure that that battle is sort of equal and produces an accurate and fair outcome, criminal defendants are often given a very strong set of rights. And in fact, in the United States Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, the most ink is spilled outlining and protecting criminal defendants' rights. The number of words that protect other types of rights in the first 10 amendments is much smaller than what is given over to criminal defendants' rights. And that is a recognition that the legal rights are extremely important. They're not important to making sure the democratic process plays out in a fair, open, and competitive way, but they are important in making sure that the relationship between individuals and the government is one that is not tyrannical. If you don't have strong criminal defendants' rights, people who aren't guilty could go to jail, and that is fundamentally undermines our emphasis on individualism. If you go to jail for something you didn't do, then that doesn't treat you as an individual with the dignity and respect that you're supposed to have based on our conception that in a democratic society you're both a member of the common good and you're a single individual with rights that just belong to you alone. Political rights, to get back to political rights, what other political rights are needed to facilitate a fair competition and an open democratic system? The right to vote, the right to run for office, the right to petition. Are there other rights that either need to be granted or limited that will produce fair outcomes? One of the big questions in political rights is, what about money in politics? Do you have a right to give unlimited contributions, or is that right attenuated? So our political rights refer to all of our interactions with the democratic system. Running for office, voting, campaigning, donating money, advocating. Freedom of the press is typically seen as an important political right that is attenuated in certain ways to make sure that the press does its job, because the press is an important and essential mechanism. Even if it's not a government-run mechanism, it's seen as an essential mechanism in making sure that we have a healthy democratic system. And so freedom of the press is typically seen as a political right. Now, economic rights in the public sphere are usually property rights. The rights that you have against the government taking your property. Now, one of the ways in which this right cannot be, like all other rights, has to be attenuated, can't be absolute, is you can't have an absolute right to your property against government invasion, because the government needs money to do these things, to run a democratic system, to run a legal system, to enforce the policies that get passed through the legislature. That requires money, and the democratic system can't rely on voluntary contributions. So there has to be some enforced seizure of property. That's one of the ways to think of taxation. Some people think of taxation as the government stealing your money to do its job. Other people think of taxation as the government taking what is owed to society by all the individual members. Whichever way you think of taxation, and in America we tend to lean in the direction, at least right now, and I would say for a while, in the direction that taxation is kind of like theft. But whichever way you see taxation, it is necessary. Is it an important necessity or a necessary evil? That is up to different viewpoints, but it has to happen. So your property cannot be absolutely secure. So how strong are your property rights? And what do your property rights extend to? In some societies, your property rights extend to your personal possessions, not to property that is seen as productive property, right? You don't necessarily have an absolute right to own land, or to own natural resources, or to own productive capacities like factories or machinery. Those are seen as being partly individual property and partly society's property. Every democratic society at least respects personal possessions. My car, my television, my phone, my clothes, my house, those sorts of things. The question is, how strong, how extensive are the property rights? And this is in relation to the government. Other economic rights are about the relationship between private parties, like workers' rights, job security, worker associations like unions. What rights need to be protected so that workers can face their employers on a fundamentally equal basis? What are the consumer rights that are necessary to make sure that over here in the economic sphere, the private sphere, the economic part of it, that exchanges are actually free exchanges? If you don't have rights to accurate information that are protected, people with products that they're selling to you can cheat you, and that's generally seen as a violation of our sort of the integrity of our individual decision making. So those are some of the economic rights over here. Property rights, how extensive? What are the limitations, and what are the ways in which the government can legitimately infringe our property rights? Eminent domain is a concept that's normally seen as an attenuation of our property rights, our economic rights, because the government can take private property for public usage under certain kinds of criteria. So that is a big question. Economic rights over here are about relations of different private economic actors, workers and employers, consumers and sellers, people who are parties to different kinds of economic exchanges like barters and sales. So they are quite different because consumer rights belong over here. What are consumer rights? Do consumer rights need to be enumerated? The US Constitution doesn't enumerate consumer rights. Many constitutions actually do, or at least enumerate a couple of them. Now, human rights is a thing that tends to be a weird one because, for Americans anyway, we don't have protections for human rights in our constitutional scheme. What are human rights? Human rights tend to be seen as the things that we are owed from society via the government, right? What does the government provide for us? That are owed to us as the basics of our humanity. Are we owed some kind of basic security, basic material security? Yes or no? That for some, in some societies, and definitely to the United Nations, that is seen as a human right. As a human being, you have the right to a basic level of subsistence. Do you have rights to health care? Do you have rights to some kind of retirement, some kind of social security? Do you have a right to education? Are these things that the government would have to provide to you, are they a requirement or not? This is the area really where there's probably the most diversity of conceptions of formalized rights in the regime of, in the world of democratic regimes. Because some societies have a very rich set of human rights that are provided. The right to housing, right, which we don't have in the United States. The right to basic health care, which we don't have in the United States. The right to Social Security, which we have through statute, but not through the constitutional scheme. The right to education, the right to, I guess those are the ones, okay? These are essentially service rights, if you want to think of them. What services does the government owe us as part of our humanity? What do they have to provide? There's a lot of debate about this. And one of the things that typically happens, and this definitely happens in the United States, is that the human rights questions are not answered in the fundamental contract, the Constitution itself. They're not enumerated. These tend to be fought out in the realm of democratic politics and policymaking, right? We have a right to a free public education in the United States, not because the US Constitution enumerates it, but because policy battles have been fought and won to guarantee that particular right. We have certain kinds of rights to health care that don't exist in our Constitution and only exist because of the Affordable Care Act. We have the Social Security system that guarantees us a sort of basic support for people in their retirement or people who are disabled. That is also not in our constitutional scheme. That is a result of a statutory battle that was won during the Great Depression. So human rights are the most diverse, I would say the most controversial, and often instead of being enumerated in the Constitution itself, they're enumerated as a result of political battles. This is, in a way, how the people express their will through these political battles, is by saying, yes, the right to a K-12 education for free for every citizen's children, or for all residents' children, not even citizens. That is a human right that must be provided by the government. People have that right in relation to the system. You have to give us that. That's not true in every democratic society. In fact, semi-privatized education systems are relatively common in democratic societies in the developing world, where educational systems are paid for through fees and are not necessarily just provided for free to everybody. So, lots of questions that need to be answered in different domains, and as I have said throughout this class, there are lots of different options. You could have a democratic society that guarantees you a basic income, and that would be one of the human rights. And you could have another society that's also democratic that doesn't guarantee a basic income. You could have a society that guarantees right to civil disobedience, and a society that doesn't guarantee right to civil disobedience, and both of those are democratic. The biggest question underlying it, I mean, this is the specific question, what rights do people have in relation to the system of government? The underlying question is, what rights need to be provided to make sure that the people can make collective decisions in a fair and accurate way? Just to sort of just touch briefly into the healthcare debate, there are definitely some people who say that if you don't have basic healthcare provided for you, if you don't have that level of security, you're not going to be able to participate in the public sphere in any kind of realistic way because you're too insecure in your health and you're having to spend too much time and too much of your resources just having that basic need met. So healthcare is in a way seen as not just a human right, but as a underlyingly political right. If people are worried about their health, they cannot participate in this collective decision-making process. So what rights are needed to make sure the collective decision-making process is carried out in a way that enables the will of the people to be discovered and enacted in the most accurate and fair way possible. Over here, the question is, what rights do people need to have to make sure that they can be sovereign individuals, that they can make decisions on their own, right? What are the individual rights that we need? Do we need freedom of action? How much? Freedom of movement? Do we need gun rights? Do we need freedom of religion or not? Economic rights. What are our specific rights in relation to sellers? What are our specific rights in relation to employees and employers? Again, there are different options where you can say, well, collective bargaining rights are fundamental to individual sovereignty. If workers can't come together in an association and bargain as a union, a collective unit with their employers, then we have a disproportionate amount of economic power that allows some people, employers, to control outcomes more effectively than other people, and so we don't actually have a society based on individual sovereignty. So the question over here is, what is needed to be protected to make sure that individuals are sovereign? That is, they get to rule themselves. The question over here is, what rights are necessary so that the people can be sovereign, so that the people can rule themselves collectively? And so these are the two big questions that any specific questions about, well, what are the formalized rights going to be? What is necessary to making sure that the people can choose for themselves collectively? What is necessary to make sure that individual people can choose for themselves personally? Those are the things that get put into our formalized system of rights.